So recently had a condenser unit replaced here and the evaporator coil. Unfortunately, it looks like we missed a leak here. You can see right here all the oil coming back. Okay, so now this is the morning after the repair was made. What it turned out to be was a leaking Schrader valve, and it was just blowing back across here, which is why we had all the oil there, which is all now cleaned up, good to go. Line's nice and chilly, cooling things off. So that's what this one turned out to be, was a leaking Schrader valve. There's definitely a lot of reasons when you have a leak to suspect the Schrader valve. One of the reasons is it gets a lot of wear and tear from hooking up the service lines of the Schrader valve itself. The other reason is because when someone goes to pressure test the system or do a vacuum test, they're already hooked up at the Schrader valves. So there's nothing for them to measure there. As long as the gauges are hooked up, the leak isn't showing up, because if it's at the Schrader valve and they're connected to that port, the Schrader valve's engaged and the gauges are keeping any leak from showing up. So, you know, perhaps they pull a vacuum and the vacuum holds because the Schrader valve, because the gauges are hooked up at the Schrader valve. But as soon as they take off the gauges, maybe the leak shows up. And usually if they had a vacuum and they're hold their vacuum with the gauges, and then they're going to switch the refrigerant and charge with the refrigerant, they still haven't disconnected any hoses from the Schrader valves. So charge the system and add all the Freon and everything, still monitoring with the gauges. Again, the gauges still have not been disconnected. Then gauges are disconnected, caps put on, and go away. And if there was a leak there, it might not show up for a little while. Anyway, it's kind of the reasons why the Schrader valve doesn't always get caught if it is the source of a leak. It's a good idea when servicing the valves or servicing the system, or anytime gauges are hooked up, after putting the caps back on with the O-rings, making sure you have the O-rings in these Schrader valve caps, you go ahead and leak test here and here, either with soap bubbles or with an electronic leak detector. And that's a good way to prove that there's not a leak at the Schrader valves, because again, it may not show up. You're not going to see it on your gauges. You know, if you had a leak in the plumbing line, well, you'd see a fluctuation in your pressures, or you'd see, if you had pulled a vacuum, you'd see you didn't hold the vacuum and your leak would show up. But again, if it's here, it may not be that easy to catch. So once you're finished charging, you put your Schrader valve caps back on, that's a good time to leak test at the Schrader valves, just to prove that you're not going to lose the charge, especially as Freon or R22 is getting more and more expensive. It's a good idea to take more preventative measures to make sure your charge stays where you want it to be.